Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. She is also the former Finance Minister of Nigeria, and she joins me now live. Madam Director General, welcome to FP Live.
Thank you, Ravi.
Real pleasure to have you on. So I thought we'd just begin with the news. This week, the Biden administration announced a big expansion of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. It raised them by a full 100%. Tariffs were also increased on steel, aluminum, solar. But I think the EV move is the biggest one because Chinese electric vehicles are cheaper and some would say better than many of their American counterparts. And so the US move is designed to keep these vehicles out. As the head of the World Trade Organization, how do you view this? I mean, do you see this as just blatant protectionism?
Ravi, let me say this, that at the WTO, we are worried about increasing protectionism in the world from the measures we see taken. And we are worried about protectionism because we think that might have an effect or impact on fragmenting trade. And this is something we certainly do not want to see. Some estimates we've made of trade fragmenting into two geopolitical blocks, for example, shows that there would be in the longer term a 5% loss in real global GDP. That's very significant. And the losses would be bigger for developing countries. So this is something we would not like to see. Now, that being said, when members take measures, remember that the WTO is a member-driven organization, and the way we work depends a lot on how members take action. So if one member takes measures and there's another member that feels that these measures are harmful, it's up to that member to so determine and to use the various remedies that are available to WTO members to take care of this. I'm proud that we do provide a fora here at the WTO where members can bring their trade concerns. Many people don't know this, that it's not just the dispute settlement panel, but we have committees where specific concerns can be brought by any member feeling that another member's measures are harmful. And many times—
But isn't this, sorry to interrupt, but isn't this exactly what some people criticize the WTO for? Because in an ideal world, if the United States had problems with Chinese practices, if they think that China is heavily subsidizing the EV market, it would just go to the WTO for resolution. But I guess critics say that WTO cases take too long to resolve, and then the appellate body is defunct.
Well, put it this way, people really look at the WTO and think only of the appellate body. But I want to share what I've shared in other fora, that the dispute settlement understanding of the WTO does have other avenues for resolving disputes. And yes, the US could come to utilize any one of these. Actually, the US is one of the heaviest users of the dispute settlement system of the WTO, but we don't have control over how a member chooses to respond. But the member that feels harmed by these measures is free to come to the WTO to take up those issues. And it is true that there have been complaints that the dispute settlement panel and the appellate body system takes too long to come up with the answers or the judgments to issues that are brought. And that is why we are right now in the midst of reforming the system to make it more responsive, quicker. Some of those criticisms are true, and members are working to reform it. And we at the Secretariat are supporting this. Hopefully we'll get it done. Ministers have said that we should finish the reform of the system by the end of this year.
And can you describe a little bit what those reforms might look like and what level of confidence you have that they can be pushed through? Because, of course, you have been calling for reform for quite a while. And at the just concluded ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi, again, I mean, I'll cite Bloomberg, which described it as chaotic, contentious, dominated by disorder and confusion. How worried are you about the WTO being able to make the reforms that you want to put in place?
Well, let me first beg to disagree with Bloomberg. Of course, any paper is free to describe any process the way they want, but you can talk to members of the WTO and get their opinion. It is true that we didn't get all the results we wanted, but there were very important results for developing countries. We had 2 new members join the WTO. If it is all that chaotic and not desired, why do we have members wanting to join? We now have 2 new members and 22 waiting in the queue, with many of them working really hard. So you've got to ask yourself the question, what is the value of the WTO that makes these countries take 5, 6, 7 years reforming their economies just to join? And it is because the WTO gives value. Without it, I think the world will be let me now use the word chaotic, that it would be in a chaotic state, because world trade would not be governed by any rules. So I think that we should all remind ourselves that we shouldn't take the WTO and its rules for granted. You mentioned, I can tell you 75% of world trade takes place on most favored nation basis. That is the basis, the basis that the WTO accords its members, and that's what makes trade stable, predictable, and fair. Yes, we have at the margin all these issues, but we shouldn't forget what the majority of world trade is working on. So I disagree with Bloomberg's characterization. There were 1 or 2 agreements that we would have liked to close, like the agreement on doing away with fishery subsidies. We did close part 1 at MC12, the 12th ministerial, 19 months ago. We wanted to continue and close part 2. We're very close. We didn't do it. So that was disappointing, but we must look at both sides of the ledger.
I take your point on that, but let me phrase this a different way. If a country breaks trade rules, there's no doubt that a lot of trade is working. But if a country breaks trade rules, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, who enforces rules today?
So if a country, so the WTO is the guardian of a lot of agreements that govern world trade and keep it, as I said, stable, open, and predictable. And the way it works is this, which is very puzzling to many members of the public. A member of the WTO that feels another member has broken trade rules comes to the WTO and makes the case that, look, these actions have harmed us, and we want to take action at the WTO. And I want to tell you that the WTO dispute settlement system is still working. There are 9 cases before it right now. It's just at the 2nd level, the appellate body is not working at the moment. And that's why we're seeking to reform, take account of all the complaints about the way it works and reform it. But the dispute settlement system still works. So a member would bring those disputes to the WTO.
I want to get to some of the bigger picture topics we wanted to discuss today. And so I mentioned at the start that with the global financial crisis and then the pandemic, there have been all of these big shocks to how countries think about trade. And I want to just understand the roots of the problem here. Why do you think countries are beginning to talk more about nearshoring and securing their supply chains? And does that constitute deglobalization in a sense?
Well, I think that talks of deglobalization may be overstated. I think that what has happened is that the disruptions and the vulnerabilities we saw during the pandemic in particular with global supply chains led a lot of countries and members to feel that, look, we are vulnerable and maybe we shouldn't be dependent. But I think there's we should be careful how we diagnose the problem. We think that many people talk about interdependence as the problem. We think the problem is overdependence. If you look at what really happened, you see that, yes, we are over-dependent on certain sectors and certain geographies in some supply chains. And that is something that should be worked on, and we should diversify and deconcentrate those supply chains. What do I mean by that? It is not right that during the pandemic, 80% of vaccines pharmaceuticals were exported by 10 countries in the world. When people were dying, it meant that there were countries waiting to get this. So is that something you want to look at and see if you can diversify and deconcentrate those supply chains and produce more in other parts of the world? I would say absolutely yes. That's an issue. Semiconductors, 95% produced in one place, in one geography. Perhaps the world should look, yes, at deconcentrating and diversifying that. Critical minerals processed in one country, 90% in China. Is that something we should look at? Yes, maybe we want to deconcentrate. So we should be careful about the analysis that we come to. What we want is, let's not be over-dependent, but we can be interdependent. And interdependence through trade has brought the world a lot of good and is still doing good. Let's remember, it's lifted 1.5 billion people out of poverty. It has benefited both developed and developing countries. And throughout all these crises, I would say that trade has been largely resilient. So let's bear that in mind.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. But, one thing I often think about is that at a nation by nation level, a lot of the benefits of globalization through history have been accrued, I guess, by developed countries, and developing countries are catching up, in part because of globalization. But a lot of the protectionist ideas that we see today are coming from the richest countries. They're the ones that can enact industrial policies. And I'm curious how much of what we describe as deglobalization, how much of that is a backlash to the rise of the rest? A struggle against the way power in general is not or will not be as concentrated in the West in the future.
Well, I think one of the things that is, sometimes frustrating about trade is that often trade measures or trade is used to solve problems that may not sometimes be trade related. Sometimes it is trade related, but many times it may not be. There may be geopolitical problems, but to solve them, trade is often the instrument that is used. And I do wish it were not the case. But let me say this. It is true that globalization has been largely beneficial and global trade to the world. But there were poor regions of rich countries and poor people who were left behind. And there were also poor countries who did not benefit as much from globalization as they should. Now, does that mean that now we say, let's throw this away? Our answer here at the WTO is no. What we want to do is not do away with globalization because of maybe some other reasons that may be geopolitical. We should reimagine globalization so that it can benefit poor people in rich countries who didn't benefit and poor countries who were left at the margins of global trade. That's what we want the world to go into what we call reglobalization. So instead of talking of deglobalization, let's talk of reglobalization. Let us see the opportunity in this issue of supply chain resilience. By using this as a means of diversifying and deconcentrating supply chains to those places that didn't benefit, to those countries that were left on the margins, to those regions that did not benefit from the first wave of globalization. And there's a big opportunity, critical minerals. If we feel that critical minerals are too concentrated, why don't we develop those value chains now in some of the countries that have these resources? Not just go there to extract and export, but develop the entire value chain. That way we create jobs in those countries, we create value in those countries, we bring them into the center of global trade. So the world can now benefit from another type of globalization, and it can help us with inclusion. So we are killing two birds with one stone. We're building resilience and we're being inclusive. Now, let me say, I just want to add that people will say, well, businesses should make those decisions and they will only go to places that are business friendly. Absolutely. But we are arguing that if you look at the world, it's not just China plus one. It's not only China plus Vietnam. You have many, or China plus India, or China plus Indonesia. You have many more countries that have the right business environment where you can diversify and deconcentrate supply chains and bring those countries into the mainstream.
You know, Madam Director General, everything you're saying makes perfect sense, especially if we're looking at the world as a vacuum. But the problem is that the two biggest economies in the world are acting in a very different way from what you're prescribing. China, as you know so well, has broken trade rules for a very long time. And now the United States as well is increasingly putting in place protectionist measures. And this is bipartisan, and we can get to a potential Trump administration in the future and what that might do. But it is broadly bipartisan in the United States to now direct foreign policy and domestic policy through purely a prism of competition with China. And in that general mood of protectionism, of thinking about everything, supply chains through a national security lens, through a protectionist lens. And then other countries and regions also begin to follow that and practice their own industrial policies. Doesn't that then just, you know, break what you're describing as an attempt to reglobalize?
Let me answer in this way. Of course, I'm not talking in a vacuum. I want to say that what I talked about as reglobalization is already happening. We just need to leave businesses alone to make that decision to diversify. You see, they are going to Morocco, to Bangladesh, to Costa Rica, to many other countries. So it is happening. In spite of what you say is big power politics between China and the United States. And yes, we are concerned about that. We would not want the world to fragment into two trading blocks, one with the US and one with China, because that will be a big loss to the world. In terms, I mentioned it before, when we do these studies of such a break, it shows everyone would lose. The US would lose, China would lose, and I think developing countries would lose more if we broke into two geopolitical blocks along those lines. So we are very concerned. We are watching now to see and hoping that we will not see a further deterioration in the relationship. The measures announced, we looked at them. The EVs are only 2% of the US EV market. And the other measures, I think all the things that tariffs were slapped on, totaled about 7% of US-China trade in last year in 2023. So if things are kept narrow sectorally and not spread and broadened, then we might be able to move along. But yes, we're certainly concerned, like you are, that we don't want to see a further escalation of these kinds of measures between the two big powers in the world, the two big economies.
And, you know, you just rightly pointed out, I think, that this kind of a zero-sum mentality, it would be bad for the United States. It would be bad for China, purely in trade and economic terms. I want to spend a minute talking, though, about smaller countries. So as bigger countries focus more and more on industrial policy, and whether we can prevent them or not, they focus more on protectionism. What happens to smaller countries that aren't able to play that game in the same way? So if you're a country like Sri Lanka, what protections are there globally to help them partake in global trade, to not feel excluded, to not be left behind in a world in which the big players are playing a different game?
Well, this is why the big players playing a different game matters, and why we need to point out that there are negative spillover effects on smaller players. Indeed, countries like smaller countries, you mentioned Sri Lanka, but many others who do not have the fiscal space to subsidize to the extent that bigger countries can, will be on the losing end, because it means that they won't be able to compete. And this is why this is of great concern. But, you know, let us say that even if we pursue industrial policy purely with subsidies, it also rebounds within those countries that are giving the subsidies. They don't necessarily in the longer term gain. I mean, Their industries may become less competitive, for instance. And so the subsidy game is a very expensive one. I don't think it's a game that should be, we don't want a subsidy race to the bottom. We want a race to the top. Now, not all subsidies are bad. There's no ideological thing against subsidies. There are areas and places where you can indeed use subsidies sensibly to support research and development to go green, for instance. There are many areas where subsidies work, but it is how you use the subsidies that may result in negative spillovers on countries that don't have the same resources. And we really do want to avoid that.
I'm wondering how much of all of this right now, as you're sitting at the WTO, how much do you blame the United States for where we are? Because there's a line of thinking that goes, much of the global system that we have right now, whether it's the UN, whether it's the post-Bretton Woods order that we're all in, the United States has backstopped it. It's built it, and it has often talked about the importance of a rules-based international order. And it's becoming increasingly clear now that the United States itself often abuses global trade laws. It often breaks those very rules that it has, preached for many decades. And because of that, other countries are also incentivized to do so as well. And then the whole system just looks rigged or broken. Is that a fair assessment? And I'm imagining on the back end, there are discussions that you have with your counterparts in the United States and elsewhere to change that behavior.
Well, look, I mean, I want to say this. We haven't yet seen a whole lot of countries who are not playing by the rules. Let me just start with that statement. And I think it's also up to the countries to whom trade matters so much to make clear that the multilateral trading system is valuable to them and they don't want to see it broken. So rather than assigning blame, of course, I want the US as the founder of the system and all those other countries that were at the beginning of the rules-based system to stay constant to it, to support it and not undermine it, to find a way to resolve issues that may arise within it. And I still think that that is doable. But that being said, I think it's also incumbent on other countries who are part of this system to stand up and be counted to say, look, we need this system. We need to support the multilateral trading system. There are middle powers for whom this trade multilateral rules and a rules-based system are so important when your trade to GDP ratio is over 100%. If you look in Europe, for instance, there are many countries with very high trade to GDP ratios. Even outside, Korea, 95, 97%, Germany, 100%. And I could go on, UK, 70%. So there are other significant big countries for whom trade matters. Singapore, I could go on naming more and more. So I think all countries that have trade as very central to their to the well-being and job creation in their economies also need to come together and to support the rules-based system. And by the way, I want to say something. They are. The majority of WTO members, and I'm very grateful to them for that, do support the system, are trying to make sure that we maintain the rules-based system and hopefully come to a situation where even the two largest economies in the world will be able to dialogue with each other and not fragment the system.
So I have to ask you this. Former US President Donald Trump has previously warned that he'd pull the United States out of the WTO if it, quote unquote, doesn't shape up, whatever that means. And he recently said that he will pass a Trump Reciprocal Trade Act, were he to get reelected, which would basically mirror tariffs any country imposes on America. What would you say to an electorate in the United States as they're thinking about, Trump or Biden or a third candidate? How should they be thinking about America's role in the global trading system?
Look, Ravi, it's not my place to comment on elections in any one country. It's up to Americans to vote for who they want to be president. What I can comment on to Americans is that the multilateral trading system has delivered for the country and is still delivering for the United States. It's helped the US. I mean, there are some estimates that over the decades since the GATT came into being until 2023, last year, the US has gained about $2.6 trillion through trade into its economy. That is huge. These are estimates by Peterson Institute, the World Bank, and others. So I think we need to remember that on a per capita basis, US households have gained from trade. It's often blamed for job losses. And yes, there are some losses in the manufacturing sector. But if we look at the turnover of jobs, about 50 million a year in the US, trade only accounts for about 0.6% of this. And trade creates jobs in other areas like services, which no one ever talks about. We are fixated on manufacturing and goods, but services drives much of the economy in the US as well. So I would say all of that to people in the US, that on balance, trade has been beneficial, can still be beneficial. Yes, it is not perfect, but we can certainly deal with the issues that where trade is not delivering in the way they think it should. So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is what I'd be saying to them. So that's the way I would like to convince them.
And they're listening to your message right now. I'll just take a subscriber question. Diane Vaught asks, what role the WTO and multilateralism can play in encouraging international stability and peace in a world where conflict is very much on the rise. And she also adds within this that there's clearly a rise in the role of non-state actors in conflict. So they're sort of outside of the international structure. How do you think about that and the impact it has on trade?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, because if you remember what led to the creation of GATT and the Bretton Woods system and the multilateral trading system after the Second World War, it was this belief that when countries trade with each other and they're interdependent, this will drive peace if people can prosper together. And I would say that if you look at the 70, 80 years since, that this model has largely delivered. And that is why we insist that people are beginning to take that model for granted, and they've forgotten what it has delivered. So we still believe that trade and interdependence can yield benefits for the world, not over-dependence, which is what I told you we have now. The over-dependence on certain sectors and geographies to produce certain goods. That we should certainly take care of by diversification. But let us not forget what trade has done and can do. So that is what I would submit. Now, non-state actors. This is something that is outside the sort of government area, and it's not very easy to get your hands on. So yes, that is a problem that we all have to worry about. But equally, I worry about the impact of climate change on trade. So there are other factors that we also need to be concerned about and to prepare for that may change the patterns of where we trade, what we trade. Changes in climate may drive changes in trading patterns, and we need to prepare and be aware of that.
So we started this conversation with electric vehicles, and I think it's fitting to end it there too. One of our subscribers, Bobby Noyant, points out that batteries for EVs require lithium, cobalt, and other critical minerals, which have very low processing margins. And so they have profit margin primarily is in the finished product. And his question is that if other EV battery companies are struggling to capture the market, what is China to do with the excess supply of these materials? So if domestic demand was low, would it export the product to other markets?
Well, I think the natural action in any country that produces where domestic demand is low is to try to export it elsewhere. And I think that's what China has been doing. Now, for those countries and places that do not have the capacity to manufacture these things for themselves, you know, maybe that those will be ready export markets who would be happy to have Chinese products. There may be other markets that feel that, you know, we don't want to see our own manufacturing overtaken by products that are cheap. And this is what we've been talking about. How do you deal with such a situation? Hopefully we find ways to deal with it that don't lead us to more protectionism. But what I wanted to say about critical minerals, more important to me is, and to us at the WTO, is to think of other places where these critical minerals are produced. And many of those places are developing countries that are, some of them, quite poor. And I think that we should be concerned that these development and mining of these minerals should take place within those countries. We should develop the value chains there, particularly if you can also develop renewables and clean energy sources in the same places, so that you can green the production of these lithium, cobalt, and all the other critical minerals you're talking about. So that's what we are thinking of. How can we stop relying on one geography or maybe China to process everything, and decentralize and diversify to several of the other countries that have these critical minerals and produce the batteries there? I think those are the things we should be worrying about, because that will help us also tackle job creation, lifting incomes up in developing countries that have not had a chance.